Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Smiling Frame channel. Please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button if you enjoy our content. Today, we are going to be discussing the film Shrek the Third from 2007. The narrative unfolds with Shrek comfortably ensconced in his swamp, finding his idyllic existence increasingly interrupted by the demands of royal life. King Harold, Shrek's father-in-law, having suffered a sudden collapse, passes the crown to Arthur Pendragon, or Artie, a distant, rather awkward high school student. This news, delivered by the ever-scheming Merlin, pulls Shrek away from Fiona and the quiet domesticity they've established. Shrek, never one for fanfare or responsibility, immediately sees the monarchy as a threat to his hard-won peace. He sets off for Worcestershire Academy, a place that seems deliberately designed to breed social discomfort, to retrieve Artie. Accompanying him are the ever-loyal donkey and Puss in Boots, the swashbuckling feline whose past life as a potential matador, or perhaps just a particularly dramatic house cat, informs his flair for the dramatic. Artie, as it turns out, is a complete disaster socially, frequently embarrassing himself in front of his peers, including a popular jock crowd. Shrek's initial attempts to convince Artie to take the throne are met with understandable resistance. The boy is terrified of leadership, a feeling Shrek himself knows intimately, given his own journey from feared ogre to reluctant hero. Meanwhile, back in Far, Far Away, Fiona faces her own crises. She discovers she is pregnant, a development that further cements her commitment to stability, making Shrek's sudden departure even more stressful. While the men are away, a new threat emerges, one rooted in deep-seated resentment. Prince Charming. Having never recovered from his failure to secure the happy ending with Fiona, Charming sees Artie's ascension as his golden opportunity. He rallies a band of theatrical villains, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, who is decidedly awake and rather displeased with her romantic narrative, and Snow White, all of whom feel overlooked by Hollywood, or perhaps just by fate. Their goal is simple: seize the kingdom while the legitimate heirs are gone. Shrek, Donkey, and Puss manage to escape Worcestershire with Artie, though not without considerable difficulty. Their journey is a study in contrasts. Shrek's gruff pragmatism, bumping up against Artie's wide-eyed insecurity. They eventually run into the wizard Merlin, whose impressive but chaotic command of magic often results in accidental transformations, such as Donkey and Puss fusing temporarily into a single, very confused creature. This interlude highlights the underlying theme of identity. Even magical beings struggle to control who they are or who they are momentarily forced to become. When they return to a kingdom already under siege, the situation is dire. Charming has successfully taken control, imprisoning Fiona and the other female fairy tale figures, including the formidable Queen Lillian, Fiona's mother. Charming's vision for the future is a stage production where he dictates the final scene, ensuring he gets the spotlight. The climax revolves around a clever, if desperate, plan. Shrek realizes that Artie's strength isn't in commanding armies, but in inspiring those who feel like outcasts. Shrek convinces Artie to address the disgruntled fairy tale characters Charming has employed, the hapless villains who actually just want a decent role. Artie, drawing on his own experience of being an outsider, delivers a heartfelt speech that appeals not to heroism, but to self-acceptance. This moment is pivotal. Artie finally steps into a role, not as a king, but as a relatable leader. The tide turns. The rallied outcasts, aided by the acrobatic efforts of Fiona, Lillian, and the other captured princesses, who prove far more capable than their damsel stereotypes suggest, overwhelm Charming's forces. Shrek confronts Charming, not with brute force, but with a refusal to participate in Charming's melodrama. Charming, unable to handle a reality where he is not the star, meets an ignominious end, often swallowed by the stage curtains or something equally anticlimactic. In the resolution, Artie agrees to take the throne, but only on the condition that he can reform the school system and make it more inclusive, proving that his true calling is in education or perhaps social reform, rather than absolute rule. Shrek, having fulfilled his duty by ensuring the kingdom's stability and witnessing Artie find his footing, returns to the swamp. He and Fiona welcome their newborn ogre children, their family unit now complete, finally secure in the knowledge that they can manage chaos both within their home and occasionally in the outside world. The film concludes with the acceptance that true happiness lies not in fulfilling external expectations, but in embracing the messy, loving reality of one's own life. The initial tranquility of the swamp, that muddy paradise Shrek had fought so hard to secure, felt increasingly like a fragile bubble waiting to be popped by the relentless tide of civilization. His irritation at being pulled back into courtly affairs was palpable. He was an ogre whose greatest ambition, one could argue, was to maintain a healthy distance from anything requiring a crown or fine linens. King Harold's sudden health crisis, a severe case of being too old and perhaps too human for the pressures of state, transferred the burden onto the entirely unprepared shoulders of Artie. Artie, a young man whose primary mode of existence seemed to be avoiding eye contact and tripping over his own feet, was the antithesis of everything a monarch should be, which ironically made him seem slightly more relatable than the established nobility. Shrek's reluctant expedition to Worcestershire Academy was less a quest and more an exercise in forced mentorship. Puss in Boots, whose dramatic sensibilities were likely honed by years of being adored as a pampered feline, approached the whole affair with the swagger of a retired Zorro, providing flair where pragmatic planning was needed. Donkey, whose boundless, often exhausting optimism serves as the necessary counterbalance to Shrek's perpetual gloom, saw the journey as another grand adventure, conveniently forgetting the potential dangers. Artie, navigating the labyrinth of adolescence and inherited royalty, was a portrait of social terror. He embodied the fear of inadequacy that plagues so many young people thrust into the spotlight, the fear of being judged by the sneering, polished crowds who valued image above substance. Shrek saw echoes of his own ostracization in Artie's plight, which softened his abrasive exterior just enough to make the recruitment attempt. The domestic drama brewing back at the castle was just as potent. Fiona, newly pregnant, was grappling with the imminent reality of parenthood, a state that demanded stability. Shrek's vanishing act only amplified her anxiety. She understood his aversion to responsibility, but now, with a family expanding, those responsibilities felt more concrete, less optional. Prince Charming, that perpetually aggrieved thespian of villainy, saw the unfolding chaos as his cue to finally take center stage. His past failures were clearly fuel for his current ambition. He wasn't just seeking a throne, he was seeking validation through a perfectly executed narrative where he was the rightful hero. His recruitment of fellow disgruntled fairy tale figures, Cinderella, whose silence probably masked years of frustration with a passive narrative, and Sleeping Beauty, clearly over her enforced nap, was an attempt to manufacture an audience and a supporting cast for his grand performance. They were all performers yearning for a rewrite of their own stories. The journey back was punctuated by the unpredictable magic of Merlin, a figure of pure chaotic potential. The temporary melding of Donkey and Puss into a single deeply conflicted entity was a moment of pure physical comedy, a visual metaphor for the way close companionship can sometimes blur individual identities beyond recognition. It emphasized the theme that even heroes or sidekicks are constantly wrestling with internal contradictions. The return to Far, Far Away revealed the success of Charming's coup. The castle was transformed into a theatrical prison. Fiona, Lillian, and the other captured princesses were reduced to props in Charming's ill-conceived play. Charming, utterly blinded by his own dramatic vision, couldn't comprehend that the fairy tale world had evolved beyond his simplistic notions of good and evil. Shrek's realization was subtle, but crucial. Artie couldn't be forced to be a traditional king. His power lay in his awkward sincerity. The climax wasn't about a sword fight. It was about a speech delivered not to knights, but to the disillusioned chorus line of villains Charming had assembled. Artie spoke not as a prince, but as someone who understood rejection. This resonated deeply with the outcasts, who realized that being a supporting character in someone else's drama was more soul-crushing than being the perceived villain in their own story. The ensuing uprising was a testament to the latent strength of the supposedly secondary characters. Fiona, Lillian, and the other princesses proved far from helpless, utilizing ingenuity rather than waiting for rescue, dismantling Charming's stage-managed takeover. Shrek's final confrontation with Charming was anticlimactic by design. Charming was defeated by the simple refusal to play along with his manufactured drama. A villain whose entire identity relies on external performance collapses when the audience walks away or refuses to clap. Artie, having found his voice, chose a path of reform over rigid rule, indicating that leadership often requires understanding the needs of the community rather than simply inheriting a title. Shrek, having played his part in stabilizing the realm and ensuring a suitable guardian for the kingdom, finally retreated home. The final image is one of profound domestic contentment. Holding his new children, Shrek and Fiona settled into a life that proved that the loudest, most anticipated, happily ever after is often the quiet, muddy, deeply personal one they built for themselves. They had navigated the outside world's pressures and confirmed that their swamp, their reality, was the only stage where they truly belonged. The return to the swamp marked not an end to responsibility, but a profound shift in its definition for Shrek and Fiona. The newborn triplets were tiny, demanding forces of nature, instantly adding a layer of immediate, non-negotiable chaos that dwarfed the logistical concerns of kingdom management. Shrek, who had initially resisted the idea of fatherhood with the same vigor he resisted royal duties, found himself surprisingly adept at the quiet, relentless work of caring for infants. This domestic immersion served as a crucial antidote to the performative stresses of the recent adventure. He learned that swaddling a squirming ogre baby required a different kind of tactical patience than negotiating with a band of frustrated fairy tale villains. Fiona, balancing the residual exhaustion of the siege with the sheer physical demands of 3 newborns, found her own strength magnified. Her mother, Queen Lillian, who had witnessed firsthand the resilience of her daughter during the takeover, remained close, offering guidance that blended royal wisdom with the practicalities of raising a new generation of unconventional figures. Lillian's presence was a quiet reassurance that the royal lineage, even when mixed with ogre DNA, possessed an inherent sturdiness. Meanwhile, Artie's reign in Far, Far Away, while less dramatic than Charming's brief tenure, was marked by persistent, earnest effort. He was diligently applying his newfound understanding of alienation to governance. Reports filtered back to the swamp, often delivered by overly enthusiastic messengers or exaggerated by a still giddy donkey, that Artie was indeed dismantling the antiquated structures of the old monarchy, focusing on inclusivity in education, a cause deeply personal to him. He wasn't the picture of imposing majesty, but he was becoming something far more valuable, an effective, empathetic leader whose past as a perpetual outsider informed every decree. Donkey and Puss in Boots, having survived their magical entanglement, maintained their close, if occasionally friction-filled, partnership. Donkey continued his relentless pursuit of finding a significant role for himself that ideally involved singing, while Puss returned to a life of calculated leisure, punctuated by moments where his swashbuckling instincts flared up, perhaps in defense of a particularly fine saucer of cream or against a particularly large housefly. Their continuing antics provided necessary levity, reminding Shrek that the world outside the swamp, while messy, was also capable of genuine, if chaotic, joy. Shrek's greatest revelation was internal. He discovered that his identity was no longer strictly defined by what he was running from, the expectations of society, the fear of being unloved, but by what he was building. The swamp was no longer just a fortress against the world. It was the foundation of his family. The constant low-level anxiety that had shadowed his life, the fear that he was fundamentally unsuited for anything beyond monstrosity, began to recede, replaced by the deep satisfaction of mundane achievement, a successful feeding, a quiet night's sleep for the babies, a shared glance with Fiona that needed no words. The world outside the mossy walls continued its chaotic spin, but for the ogre, true peace was finally discovered not in isolation, but in the deliberate, messy creation of home. The rhythm of life in the swamp settled into a pattern dictated by the needs of the tiny ogres, a far cry from the grand pronouncements of royalty that had recently dominated their landscape. Shrek, once defined by his booming refusal to conform, now found his voice softened, modulated to the gentle shushing required to soothe a fussy infant. His massive hands, capable of felling trees or wrestling formidable foes, were surprisingly adept at navigating the delicate fabric of baby clothes. This transformation from reluctant hero to dedicated domestic anchor was perhaps the most significant character arc of all. He wasn't playing a role dictated by prophecy or magic, but one chosen by love. Fiona, always possessing an inner steel honed by the expectations placed upon a princess who wanted to be an ogre, managed the simultaneous demands of motherhood and maintaining ties with the kingdom with an almost impossible grace. She understood that stability for the triplets meant actively participating in the world, even if that participation was mediated through letters and the occasional, carefully planned visit. Queen Lillian, staying nearby, proved to be an invaluable bridge. She didn't try to impose courtly etiquette on the swamp. Instead, she observed, learned, and offered practical matriarchal support. Her initial stiff formality melted away as she witnessed the raw, unvarnished reality of Shrek and Fiona's life, finding in their untamed happiness a refreshing authenticity absent in many of the stuffier royal courts she had known. She saw that the strength of the lineage wasn't in tradition, but in adaptability. The news flowing from the capital painted a picture of Artie's ongoing, slightly clumsy revolution. He governed not with the booming authority of a seasoned ruler, but with the detailed earnestness of a student eager to please his professors. Donkey, naturally, had appointed himself Artie's unofficial cultural liaison and chief herald. Donkey's energy, previously spent on annoying Shrek, was now channeled into spreading Artie's progressive message, though often with dramatic embellishments that likely twisted the original intent beyond recognition. Puss in Boots remained Artie's reluctant bodyguard, a creature of sophisticated tastes forced to reside in a place where the finest entertainment might involve chasing a surprisingly fast field mouse. Puss often lamented the lack of adequate silk bedding, yet his inherent loyalty, forged in the heat of shared peril, kept him dutifully near the young king. One particularly reflective evening, as Shrek watched Fiona gently rocking the last of the three babies to sleep, the depth of their mutual sacrifice became clear. They had traded the public spectacle of saving the kingdom for the private victory of raising a family, and in that trade, they had both gained immeasurably. Shrek recalled the grim satisfaction of intimidating villagers and contrasted it with the quiet, profound satisfaction of seeing his children smile. There was no grand score to settle here, no dramatic villain to vanquish, only the continuous, rewarding labor of love. The swamp, once a symbol of exile, was now unequivocally home, a place where being an ogre, complete with all the accompanying societal baggage, was simply the norm, accepted and cherished by those who mattered most. The days settled into a comfortable, mud-caked routine, a testament to the power of domesticity to tame even the wildest hearts. Shrek, whose very existence had been predicated on being the misunderstood outsider, now found his greatest challenge not in fighting dragons or wicked princes, but in managing the conflicting schedules of three rapidly developing ogre infants. His gruff exterior remained, of course. One cannot simply scrub away years of societal conditioning, but it was overlaid with a surprising veneer of paternal patience. He'd learned that the volume of his voice, once a weapon, now only served to wake sleeping babies, fostering a new appreciation for the hushed reverence of the swamp at dawn. Fiona flourished in this environment, her inherent capability finding its perfect outlet. She moved through the swamp cottage with the focused efficiency of a general managing logistics, yet her eyes held a warmth that spoke of her fulfillment. She was the perfect synthesis of her dual nature, the refined poise inherited from Queen Lillian mixed with the fierce, earthy protective instincts of an ogre mother. She often recounted stories to the children, tales that subtly blended the fairy tale canon with the realities of their swamp life, ensuring the triplets understood that true magic lay in authenticity, not artifice. Queen Lillian, having shed the last vestiges of her regal stiffness, had become an integral part of their daily life, her presence acting as a gentle stabilizer. She found a surprising joy in the unvarnished honesty of ogre life, a refreshing change from the exhausting dance of court politics. She even took to helping Shrek with tasks that required a certain delicate touch, often sharing knowing, slightly exasperated glances with Fiona when Shrek attempted to apply brute force to a problem that required finesse, like untangling a very complex knot in a baby blanket. The sporadic updates from the capital were invariably delivered with excessive flair by Donkey, who treated every message as if it were a major military dispatch. Donkey, still enamored with the drama of governance, saw himself as the vital link between the exiled hero, Shrek, and the new reformer, Artie. He exaggerated Artie's accomplishments with such enthusiasm that one could easily imagine the young king leading armies rather than rewriting outdated school lunch menus. Donkey's energy was an essential pressure valve, injecting necessary absurdity into their otherwise grounded existence. Puss in Boots, meanwhile, maintained his position as Artie's reluctant guardian, viewing his service not as patriotism, but as a necessary penance for past overindulgence, or perhaps just a prolonged, highly demanding vacation. He would occasionally visit the swamp, arriving impeccably groomed despite the journey, primarily to share a bottle of fine stolen wine with Shrek, while complaining bitterly about the lack of sophisticated entertainment in Worcestershire. Their camaraderie was built on a shared, unspoken understanding. Both were creatures of style and reputation, forced, temporarily, to prioritize substance over appearance for the sake of their friends. Shrek, looking at his slumbering children one evening, felt a profound sense of completion. The fight against expectation had morphed into the joy of simple belonging. He realized that his initial quest for isolation was merely a fear of vulnerability. Now, surrounded by the sounds of breathing and the scent of moss, he understood that the greatest victory wasn't winning a kingdom or securing a title, but earning the right to be utterly, unapologetically himself within the confines of a home built not of stone, but of love and acceptance. The swamp was no longer a refuge. It was the epicenter of his world. The contentment found in the swamp, however idyllic, was constantly punctuated by the inevitable encroachment of the outside world, particularly through the enthusiastic, if often misguided, reporting of Donkey. Donkey's visits were less updates and more theatrical performances, chronicling Artie's earnest attempts at modernization. Artie, it seemed, was struggling with the sheer inertia of tradition. His progressive ideas, streamlining bureaucratic processes, introducing mandatory civics classes that focused on empathy rather than lineage, and perhaps most controversially, trying to implement a more varied school cafeteria menu, were met with the sort of stiff-necked resistance one might expect from centuries-old noble families set in their ways. Donkey painted every small victory as a grand triumph, making Shrek chuckle with the sheer absurdity of the reportage. Shrek, for his part, was becoming strangely adept at reading the subtleties of infant non-verbal communication, a skill he occasionally contrasted with the blatant emotional performances of fairy tale villains he had previously encountered. He found a strange kinship between the unpredictable nature of a teething baby and the unpredictable magic of Merlin, both requiring a degree of patient management that logic alone could not solve. Fiona, ever the diplomat, used her mother's recent, more relaxed presence as an opportunity to subtly counsel Artie via correspondence, grounding his idealism with a dose of realistic political maneuvering she had absorbed during her time at court. She was guiding him away from Charming's theatrical pitfalls, emphasizing substance over spectacle in governance. Puss in Boots, during one of his infrequent, highly necessary visits for high-quality provisions, read artisanal cheeses and strong spirits, observed Shrek's domestic scene with a rare seriousness. The cat, whose theatrical exploits often masked a genuine longing for meaningful connection, seemed to recognize the peace Shrek had finally achieved. Puss understood performance. He knew the difference between the fleeting applause of a crowd and the enduring resonance of genuine affection. He perhaps saw in Shrek's quiet happiness the reward for those who dared to discard the costume of expectation. His advice to Shrek, delivered with a dramatic sigh and a flourish of his tiny rapier, usually boiled down to, "Guard this tranquility fiercely, my friend, for manufactured happiness is fleeting, like the scent of cheap perfume." The true test of their newfound balance came not from another villain, but from a realization of time passing. The triplets were beginning to crawl, transforming the swamp cottage from a place of quiet rest into a maze of immediate, messy danger. This new phase forced Shrek and Fiona to communicate not just about their feelings, but about logistical barriers and safety protocols with a speed and unity that years of courtship could not match. They were a true partnership, their individual strengths, Fiona's foresight and Shrek's sheer physical capability, meshing perfectly to protect their small, loud dynasty. The world beyond the swamp remained complex, ruled by the earnest, slightly bewildered Artie, but within their borders, Shrek had found the only kingdom truly worth reigning over, the realm of his own family. The relentless, joyous assault of the crawling triplets brought Shrek and Fiona into a state of perpetual, low-grade vigilance. The swamp, once the ultimate sanctuary of solitude, was now a minefield of potential hazards scaled to the size of a very determined ogre toddler. Shrek's movements became less about stomping and more about calculated stealth, maneuvering around overturned buckets and half-chewed tree roots with the caution of a bomb disposal expert. He found himself in constant, hushed negotiation with his offspring, low, guttural sounds that somehow conveyed both warning and affection, a unique language of fatherhood forged in the crucible of the swamp. Fiona, meanwhile, managed the political correspondence with the same focused energy she applied to teaching her children not to put mud directly into their mouths during story time. Her letters to Artie were becoming fewer, yet more pointed. She sensed that Artie, while well-intentioned, was beginning to confuse reform with simply upsetting the established order without providing sustainable alternatives. He was learning, as many heroes do, that governance is often less about inspiring speeches and more about mastering the dull mechanics of budgets and compromise. Fiona remembered her own royal upbringing with a mixture of disdain and grudging respect for the discipline it had instilled, a discipline she was now trying to gently transmit across the miles to her young cousin-in-law. Queen Lillian, observing this phase, remarked privately to Fiona that the greatest revolutionaries often struggle the most when they have to become architects. She appreciated that Shrek was not trying to change the nature of his children, but rather to accommodate their nature within a safe structure, a lesson she wished some of her past suitors had understood. Lillian's acceptance of the swamp's inherent wildness was now complete. She even developed a fondness for the slightly fermented berry juice Shrek brewed, a taste she would have previously dismissed with a shudder. Donkey's visits became shorter, usually because Artie's expanding administrative duties kept him tethered to the castle. When he did arrive, however, Donkey was practically vibrating with news. He spoke of Artie's latest challenge, dealing with the established guild of royal bakers who were staging a very polite, highly organized protest against the introduction of whole grains. Donkey saw this as a grand battle between progress and stale carbohydrates, and he relished the drama. Puss in Boots would occasionally accompany him, not out of loyalty to Donkey, but because the city offered superior opportunities for espionage involving local patisseries. Puss would often share his findings with Shrek, lamenting the decline of true culinary artistry in the capital, framing the political squabbles as a distraction from the serious business of appreciating life's finer sensory pleasures. Shrek, sitting back after a long day of baby-proofing his moss-covered home, felt a deep, unshakable peace. The memory of Prince Charming's desperate need for an audience seemed a distant, almost comical dream. He realized that true power wasn't about commanding the stage or the throne room. It was about the quiet authority one held over their own small domain. His legacy would not be a crown or a ballad sung in his honor, but the sound of 3 small contented snores echoing in their humble, perfect home. He had finally shed the skin of the misunderstood monster and settled into the skin of the beloved patriarch. The transition from high-stakes adventure to the minute-by-minute management of toddlerhood was less a deceleration and more a shift in the focus of perpetual battle. Shrek, whose physical prowess was legendary, now expended immense energy simply ensuring that none of his offspring managed to ingest something poisonous found lurking beneath a particularly interesting fungal growth. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate a destructive impulse just seconds before it materialized, a skill that ironically mirrored the preemptive thinking required of a seasoned monarch, yet applied to far lower stakes, and with much higher emotional rewards. Fiona, observing this domestic evolution, often reflected on how often life forces a person to become precisely what they once feared. She saw in Shrek the tender strength she always knew was hidden beneath the surface, a depth of care that surpassed any political alliance or military victory. Her own anxieties now centered on teaching the triplets to navigate their unique heritage, that they were both royal descendants and creatures of the wild. She meticulously curated bedtime stories, weaving in lessons about using one's voice for good, borrowing narrative techniques from the very fairy tales she once resisted, adapting them for an audience who preferred dirt baths to glass slippers. Queen Lillian, fully integrated into the swamp rhythm, had discovered a surprising talent for gardening, finding a peaceful counterpoint to the chaos in cultivating robust, if slightly oversized, vegetables. Her conversations with Fiona now focused less on statecraft and more on the long-term psychological fortitude required to raise children who would inevitably face judgment from the outside world. Lillian was imparting the subtle art of resilient indifference, the ability to maintain inner peace despite external criticism, a lesson she herself had learned over decades within the rigid structure of nobility. Donkey's reports, while still breathless, were beginning to reflect a slight maturity in Artie's leadership. The king of Far, Far Away was no longer simply enacting sweeping changes. He was weathering the inevitable backlash. Donkey recounted a particularly tense town hall meeting where Artie, instead of shouting down dissenters, had listened patiently to a grumpy nobleman complaining about the new tax on ornamental garden gnomes. Artie's response, Donkey claimed, was so genuinely empathetic that the nobleman ended up offering to personally supervise the gnome census. This indicated Artie was finally learning that effective leadership was about persuasion, not declaration, a slow, often frustrating ballet of human interaction. Puss in Boots, making his grand entrance during a rare, quiet afternoon, often heralded by the scent of expensive leather and a subtle, lingering aroma of fine brandy, served as the cynical, yet necessary, reality check. He would watch Donkey fawn over the latest royal proclamation, and then catch Shrek's eye, a shared look acknowledging the absurdity of it all. Puss, having flirted with fame and the spotlight for so long, understood the temporary nature of public adoration. His loyalty to Shrek was rooted in a respect for an individual who had managed to opt out of the entire facade of celebrity, choosing genuine connection over superficial applause. He saw Shrek as the ultimate connoisseur of life, valuing the rare vintage of true domestic bliss over the common wine of worldly acclaim. Shrek, exhausted but deeply satisfied after a day of chasing toddlers, often stood at the edge of the swamp as twilight descended. He no longer looked outward, scanning for threats. Instead, he looked inward, at the warm light spilling from the cottage windows. He realized that the epic scale of adventure was intrinsically hollow compared to the small daily acts of creation. He hadn't just saved a kingdom. He had built a world where being an ogre was not a curse or a temporary disguise, but the defining, beloved feature of his existence. The noise of his children was the sweetest symphony he had ever known. The passing seasons brought subtle shifts to the dynamics of the swamp, yet the core commitment to their unconventional family unit remained unshaken. Shrek found himself adapting to the needs of his rapidly growing children with a natural aptitude that surprised even Fiona. He had moved beyond merely reacting to potential dangers. He was now actively cultivating an environment where the triplets could explore their nascent ogreish tendencies safely. This involved constructing elaborate, mud-reinforced play structures that dwarfed the simple hurdles of his earlier life, proving that the spirit of the formidable beast was now channeled into benevolent engineering. He carried a deep, quiet pride in this newfound constructive energy, understanding that nurturing life was a far more enduring accomplishment than vanquishing an enemy. Fiona, sensing the stability Shrek provided, dedicated more time to engaging with the outside world on her own terms. Her correspondence with Queen Lillian evolved into collaborative plans for the future of the kingdom's perception of ogres. They subtly began seeding narratives within the more progressive court circles, highlighting the intelligence and organizational skills demonstrated by Shrek during the coup. Fiona understood that true acceptance required more than just winning a battle. It required rewriting the cultural script, one carefully placed anecdote at a time. She was building a legacy, not just for her children, but for her entire species within the human world. Artie's reign, as relayed by Donkey, was entering a phase of stabilization, though not without drama. Donkey painted a vivid picture of Artie confronting a council resistant to modernizing the royal archives, involving a standoff where Artie reportedly used a well-placed, humorous anecdote about Puss in Boots' near-death experience, involving a particularly aggressive thistle to break the tension. Donkey framed this as genius political maneuvering. Shrek recognized it as the desperate yet effective use of shared absurdity to bypass entrenched resistance. Donkey himself seemed to be thriving in his role as the monarch's unofficial morale booster and gossip columnist, his own need for constant engagement finally being validated by proximity to power. Puss in Boots made fewer social calls, hinting at a growing respect for Artie's perseverance, or perhaps simply finding a particularly comfortable cushion in the castle that required extensive napping. When he did appear in the swamp, he was less focused on lamenting lost luxuries and more on observing the sheer, raw vitality of the triplets. The feline seemed to grasp that this chaotic life, free from the pretense of destiny, held a richness that his swashbuckling adventures, however thrilling, always lacked. He understood that true courage wasn't facing down a firing squad of fairy tale rejects, but facing down the terrifying prospect of domestic monotony and choosing joy within it anyway. One evening, as the light faded over the murky waters, Shrek watched Fiona teaching the children a simple song about swamp creatures. It was a melody devoid of grand heroism, filled only with the sounds of nature and belonging. He felt a profound sense of finality regarding his old self. The fear of not being good enough, of being too monstrous for love, had dissolved in the steady warmth of his family. His epic journey had concluded not with him claiming a throne or a magical artifact, but with him simply being present, an ordinary, extraordinary father in his own imperfect, beautiful domain. The quiet certainty of that love was the most powerful magic he had ever encountered. The ecosystem of the swamp, once defined by its isolation, was now intricately woven with the threads of the world they had fought to keep at bay. Shrek had mastered the art of managing the triplets' boundless energy with an economy of motion that spoke of profound efficiency. He was no longer merely reacting, he was choreographing the chaos, an ogre maestro conducting a symphony of squeals and stomps. He often found himself musing that the concentration required to prevent an infant from ingesting swamp insects was far greater than the focus needed to outwit any magically inclined adversary. This quiet dominion over his small sphere was a source of immense, unarticulated satisfaction. Fiona's role as the bridge between two worlds became ever more nuanced. She was fiercely protective of their domestic bubble, yet understood that complete isolation would ultimately stifle her children's potential. Her letters to Artie often contained subtle, pragmatic advice, drawn from her own uncomfortable immersion in royalty. She cautioned him against the allure of easy popularity, reminding him that the trust earned by admitting fallibility was far more durable than the admiration won through flawless performance. Fiona was proving that true power lay not in inherited status, but in the relentless, ethical application of influence, a lesson she had clearly absorbed from her parents, despite their flaws. Queen Lillian, settled comfortably into the role of wise grandmother, was the anchor. She moved through the cottage with the easy familiarity of someone who had finally found an environment where pretense was unnecessary. She took particular delight in observing Shrek's tenderness, often remarking to Fiona that Harold, her late husband, would have been astounded, and perhaps slightly relieved, to see his formidable son-in-law exhibit such deep, uncomplicated devotion. Lillian's involvement ensured that while the triplets were raised with swamp grit, they would never be ignorant of the broader world's expectations, a balance Fiona cherished. Donkey's status had evolved from mere sidekick to an indispensable, if highly theatrical, ambassador. He was the living embodiment of Artie's burgeoning, slightly over-enthusiastic administration. Donkey's reports were now less about petty squabbles and more about the slow, grinding success of genuine reform. He spoke with fervor about Artie establishing mandatory empathy workshops for minor nobles, an initiative Donkey claimed was inspired by a profound conversation he'd had with a particularly wise toad. Donkey's enthusiasm, once grating, now felt like a necessary current of vibrant life flowing from the distant castle. Puss in Boots' visits became sporadic, marked by an air of professional necessity rather than social obligation. He seemed to be cultivating a new persona, the sophisticated, slightly melancholic observer of fading glory. He viewed the triplets not as potential sword-fighting apprentices, but as miniature forces of nature demanding respect. He understood that Shrek had achieved something far more substantial than any heroic quest. He had achieved genuine contentment without sacrificing his identity. Puss, a creature perpetually searching for the perfect setting for his own dramatic flourish, respected Shrek for realizing that the best performance is often the one left unseen, the quiet, constant act of loving fiercely. Shrek watched his family settle deeper into their life, the echoes of past dramas fading into the background noise of contented domesticity. He understood now that the true monster in any story is the fear of being fully known and accepted. He was known by Fiona, by his children, even grudgingly by his visitors. And he was accepted. The swamp was no longer an escape. It was the culmination of his journey, a place where his immense, rough-hewn heart finally found its proper, gentle measure. The final, sweet weight of his sleeping child upon his chest was the only validation he would ever need. The very air in the swamp seemed richer, scented not just with moss and damp earth, but with the unmistakable perfume of earned peace. Shrek, whose every prior action was framed by the necessity of defense, defending the swamp, defending Fiona, defending his own solitude, now expended his considerable energy on creation. He was building things, reinforced fences against curious wildlife, intricate wooden toys carved with surprising delicacy, and perhaps, most importantly, an impenetrable shield of steadfast presence around his family. This proactive care replaced the reactive aggression that had defined his younger years. He carried the posture of a creature who no longer expected confrontation, but rather welcomed the quiet routines of responsibility. Fiona, meanwhile, had become the undisputed architect of their social future. Her correspondence with the kingdom wasn't just advice, it was subtle strategic planning. She understood that Artie needed to appear both strong and accessible, a tightrope walk for a young king. She channeled her royal upbringing not into etiquette, but into the understanding of optics and long-term reputation management, recognizing that Shrek, by simply living happily, was already providing the greatest positive PR campaign for ogres in history. She taught the triplets to greet even the most unusual visitors, like a nervous talking donkey, with polite, if wary, curiosity, instilling a balanced worldview. Queen Lillian had fully embraced the role of the pragmatic matriarch, often taking the triplets on supervised excursions to the edge of the woods, teaching them rudimentary history lessons laced with surprisingly sharp political commentary about the follies of past monarchs. She saw in Shrek and Fiona's partnership a durability that traditional royal pairings often lacked, precisely because it was built on shared struggle rather than political convenience. Lillian often remarked that Shrek possessed a moral clarity that even the most seasoned courtiers lacked. He couldn't be swayed by flattery because he simply didn't believe it when it was directed at him. Donkey, in his role as royal correspondent, had begun to weave a narrative around Artie that focused on perseverance over instant perfection. He described Artie's political battles with the dignity of epic poetry, even when the subject was the proper distribution of artisanal cheese subsidies. Donkey's boundless enthusiasm was now tinged with a touch of professional pride. He was the hype man for a genuine, albeit slow-moving, revolution. His boundless need for validation found a healthy outlet in celebrating the small, meaningful victories of his friend. Puss in Boots, in his infrequent appearances, carried himself with a certain world-weariness that only added to his charm. He would observe the swamp nursery with a critical but ultimately approving eye. He saw Shrek not as a simpleton who chose mud over glory, but as a master strategist who had correctly identified the ultimate prize. Puss understood the performative life deeply. He knew that true contentment meant retiring from the stage when the standing ovation was no longer required. His loyalty to Shrek was a silent acknowledgement of a shared, hard-won wisdom, that authenticity is the most difficult and most rewarding role to maintain. Shrek looked upon his thriving, noisy little world. The anxieties that had driven him for years, the fear of being rejected, the need to push everyone away, had been systematically dismantled by the simple, undeniable facts of his life. The warmth of his wife, the demanding hunger of his children, the predictable return of his friends. He was no longer running toward or away from something. He was simply rooted. The epic saga of the ogre had resolved itself not in a final, glorious battle, but in the enduring, messy, and utterly necessary commitment to the life he had chosen. The swamp was complete. Shrek the Third, arriving in 2007, marked a curious inflection point in the otherwise consistently successful Shrek franchise. Following the high emotional stakes and mature themes of Shrek 2, this third installment struggled somewhat under the weight of expectation, leaning heavily into established comedic rhythms, while introducing a narrative structure that felt more episodic than truly compelling. The central conflict revolves around King Harold's death, and Shrek's reluctant acceptance of his destiny as the next ruler of Far, Far Away. This internal struggle, a persistent theme for the ogre, feels slightly diminished here. Mike Myers continues to lend Shrek that perfect blend of grumpy vulnerability, but the urgency often feels manufactured. His core motivation, avoiding responsibility and cherishing his private swamp life, is well-trodden ground by this point. The introduction of Arthur Pendragon, or Artie, as the heir apparent, provides the necessary catalyst for the film's adventure plot. As voiced by Justin Timberlake, Artie embodies the antithesis of Shrek: insecure, eager to please, and profoundly unsuited for leadership in his own eyes. Timberlake, fresh off considerable success both in music and emerging film roles, brings a youthful, slightly awkward energy that contrasts effectively with Shrek's seasoned cynicism. The inspiration drawn here is clearly the Arthurian legend, albeit filtered through a decidedly irreverent DreamWorks lens. The journey to recruit Artie serves as a secondary road trip subplot, echoing elements of the first film, but substituting dramatic tension with situational comedy derived from Artie's inherent lack of charisma and Shrek's impatience. Meanwhile, the secondary plot involving Merlin and Merlin's Academy feels somewhat disconnected, serving primarily to give the supporting cast their moments to shine. Donkey, voiced reliably by Eddie Murphy, remains the film's kinetic center. Murphy's improvisational style delivery contrasts perfectly with Shrek's grounded grumbling, ensuring that Donkey maintains his status as the franchise's primary source of chaotic energy. Fiona, voiced by Cameron Diaz, while supportive, is relegated somewhat to the background, particularly as the looming crisis of impending fatherhood becomes Shrek's main focus. Diaz, whose career at this point was characterized by an effervescent screen presence, grounds Fiona's anxieties about motherhood with relatable stress, yet the narrative doesn't allow her much agency beyond reacting to Shrek's decisions. The antagonist role is filled by the traditionally theatrical Prince Charming, voiced by Rupert Everett. Everett's performance leans into Victorian villainy, full of melodramatic pronouncements and festering jealousy. Charming's scheme to seize the throne by posing as the king is transparently conventional, designed less for narrative depth and more as a platform for a large-scale, final confrontation involving a collection of fairy tale villains who are dissatisfied with their quiet lives. This battle sequence, a chaotic, almost musical theater-style invasion of Far, Far Away, highlights the film's reliance on spectacle over nuanced character interaction. Thematically, the film attempts to explore the burdens of legacy and the nature of true leadership, suggesting that leadership is less about royal bloodlines and more about self-acceptance. Artie finds his confidence when he embraces his mediocrity and focuses on what he genuinely enjoys, a familiar message of authenticity that the franchise has explored before. Shrek, conversely, only finds peace when he accepts that he can be a good father and a good ruler without sacrificing his essential self. Where the film falters is pacing and originality. The narrative beats feel recycled, and the introduction of new plot mechanics, like the gender dynamics of Fiona's pregnancy, feel rushed to set up the final conflict. While the animation remains technically proficient, the visual inventiveness that characterized the first two films is somewhat muted, replaced by slightly broader, more predictable gags. Shrek the Third functions adequately as a reunion vehicle for beloved characters, but it lacks the sharp, subversive bite that made its predecessors groundbreaking entries in animated cinema. It is a comfortable, if somewhat complacent, entry, relying on the established chemistry of its cast to carry a story that doesn't quite reach the heights of its predecessors. The transition to the third film presented a unique challenge: how to escalate the stakes for characters who had already achieved their stated goals. Shrek and Fiona had found love, acceptance, and now parenthood loomed. This shift from external conflict, ogre acceptance, defeating villains, to internal domestic anxiety is palpable throughout the film, yet it often results in less dynamic storytelling. Shrek's deep-seated fear of fatherhood, voiced by Myers with his signature groans and exasperated asides, is relatable. But the film often resorts to slapstick regarding this new responsibility, rather than plumbing the depths of his commitment anxieties seen in earlier installments. Artie's character arc serves as a mirror to Shrek's own past insecurities, a necessary narrative device, but one that feels somewhat manufactured for the sake of mentorship. Justin Timberlake's casting signaled an attempt to inject fresh, contemporary energy into the narrative machinery. Artie's aspiration to escape expectation, a high school trope transplanted into medieval fantasy, lands well with younger audiences, but feels lightweight compared to Shrek's struggle against societal prejudice in the first film. His journey back to Camelot is less a true quest and more a series of comedic vignettes designed to showcase his ineptitude, which eventually softens Shrek's resolve. The dynamic between Donkey and Puss in Boots, voiced by Antonio Banderas, continues to be a reliable source of physical comedy, particularly when Donkey is magically merged with a hapless stallion. Banderas's Puss, ever the suave, swashbuckling caricature, benefits from the chaos Donkey generates. These moments are high-energy palate cleansers, but they do little to advance the main political intrigue involving Charming's coup. It speaks to the film's structural weakness. When the main plot lagged, the script invariably defaulted to sending Donkey and Puss on a distracting tangent. Prince Charming's motivation remains stubbornly one-dimensional. Rupert Everett commits fully to the melodramatic entitlement of a second-tier royal who feels perpetually overlooked. His envy isn't rooted in tragedy, as perhaps Fiona's father's disapproval was, but in sheer ego. This makes his army of disgruntled fairy tale rejects feel less like a genuine threat and more like a necessary visual spectacle for the finale. The sequence where Charming rallies these forgotten characters, the One-Eyed Jack, the Ugly Stepsisters, is a clever nod to the franchise's ability to deconstruct tropes, yet it resolves into a standard siege narrative, lacking the innovative subversion of Shrek's earlier triumphs. The film attempts to empower Fiona by placing her at the helm of the rebellion against Charming while Shrek is away. Cameron Diaz imbues Fiona with steely resolve as she manages the pregnant court and prepares for childbirth simultaneously. However, this powerful positioning is frustratingly temporary. She exists primarily as a figure awaiting Shrek's return to resolve the primary emotional arc. Her transformation into a more hardened warrior persona, motivated by protecting her family and kingdom, is compelling, but ultimately sidelined by the pursuit of Artie. Ultimately, the film suffers from an over-reliance on its established ensemble. While the vocal talent is undeniable, each performer slotting comfortably back into their roles, the narrative lacks the compelling outsider versus establishment tension that energized the first two installments. It trades subversive commentary for comforting familiarity, resulting in a middle chapter that functions smoothly as entertainment, but fails to push the boundaries of the world or its characters in any profound, lasting way. The emotion is present, the anxiety of legacy, the fear of change, but it is packaged too safely within the confines of what the audience already expected. The very air of Far, Far Away in this third outing feels heavier, burdened not by imminent danger, but by the sheer weight of domesticity. Shrek's existential dread about fatherhood is the emotional anchor, yet it often manifests as simple avoidance, a retreat into the familiar territory of wanting his swamp back. Mike Myers plays this reluctant patriarch with a weary sigh layered over his usual gruffness. One senses the creative team felt they had mined the ogre wants to be left alone trope to its very limit, forcing the narrative to pivot toward the next generation represented by Artie. Artie, the designated Prince Charming replacement, serves as a necessary foil. Justin Timberlake's portrayal captures the essence of generalized millennial insecurity projected onto a medieval figure, a young man utterly convinced of his own inadequacy. His inspiration lies in the awkward student archetype, the one everyone overlooks, which contrasts sharply with the inherent nobility often associated with Arthurian figures. The mentorship dynamic between the jaded Shrek and the eager-to-please Artie is intended to mirror Shrek's earlier reluctant growth, but because Artie starts from such a low baseline of self-worth, his transformation feels less earned and more like a necessary plot function to hand off the crown. The supporting ensemble, while providing necessary comedic relief, often highlights the structural looseness of the plot. Eddie Murphy's Donkey remains the film's uncontainable kinetic force, his exuberance practically vibrating off the screen. His temporary biological merging with Puss in Boots is a high-concept visual gag that momentarily eclipses the main plot, showcasing the studio's confidence in leaning into absurdity when narrative tension flags. Antonio Banderas's Puss, always the picture of stylized machismo, plays the straight man to Donkey's chaos, a relationship built purely on reactive comedy rather than evolving emotional stakes. Prince Charming's resurgence as the villain feels narratively retrograde. Rupert Everett delivers every line with the precise, wounded indignation of an actor who understands that the character is written entirely in italics. His grievance, that he deserves recognition simply because he is conventionally handsome and entitled, is a shallow one, contrasting poorly with the nuanced rejection experienced by Shrek in the first film. Charming functions as a necessary disruptive force, enabling the climactic battle, but his threat lacks genuine menace because his objectives are so petty and easily foiled through common sense, rather than great sacrifice. Fiona's role is perhaps the most underutilized given the potential. Cameron Diaz brings a grounded exasperation to her impending motherhood, but the film confines her actions largely to reactive management. When Shrek departs, Fiona is momentarily elevated to a position of defensive leadership, surrounded by her parents and the fairy tale community facing siege. This suggests a powerful female presence, yet the resolution hinges entirely on Shrek's successful recruitment drive. Her emotional journey is about accepting the chaos of change, both in her body and her domestic life. But the script prioritizes Shrek's external quest over allowing Fiona to fully command the defense of the kingdom she is helping to build. The film, in its effort to keep the central duo together for the final reconciliation, ultimately sidelines its female protagonist when she is at her most pivotal moment of independent agency. The overall feeling is one of satisfaction, without genuine artistic surprise. The true emotional core that the narrative struggles to sustain revolves around the concept of legacy, not just royal inheritance, but familial expectation. Shrek is grappling with the fear of becoming a distant, absent father, echoing the very archetype he despises, the demanding king. This anxiety is subtly contrasted with the situation of King Harold, whose final moments offer a moment of genuine tenderness, a passing of the torch predicated on finding happiness outside the confines of rigid duty. Harold, voiced previously by John Cleese, represented the rigid establishment, and his death forces Shrek to confront the possibility that his own definition of a happily ever after must evolve to include responsibility. The introduction of Merlin, albeit briefly, serves as a nostalgic wink to high fantasy tropes, an unnecessary diversion that showcases the film's tendency to accumulate subplots rather than focus its energy. Merlin's Magic Academy is chaotic, a visual playground for the supporting cast to engage in slapstick that temporarily distracts from the mounting pressure in Far, Far Away. This segment, while providing visual texture, dilutes the narrative thrust, suggesting a studio more interested in maximizing screen time for established fan favorites than in tightening the central dramatic focus. The film's visual ambition, while still high quality from a technical standpoint, feels less groundbreaking than its predecessors. The vibrancy of the color palette and the inventive character designs seen in the first two films seem slightly subdued here, favoring established, comfortable aesthetics. The visual payoff of the large-scale battle, involving the coordinated efforts of former fairy tale antagonists led by Charming, is undeniably spectacular in scope, aiming for a blockbuster feel. However, the emotional stakes of this battle are low because the audience knows, almost intrinsically, that Shrek will succeed, and the resolution will likely involve a large group hug rather than any lasting change to the established order. It is a film that perfectly understands the mechanics of its success, the chemistry of Myers, Murphy, and Diaz, but fails to harness that chemistry toward a truly novel destination, preferring the well-worn path of comforting familiarity over daring narrative exploration. The third installment functions as a perfectly competent holding pattern, keeping the franchise ticking over until the next, perhaps more decisive chapter. The very texture of the resolution, the ultimate acceptance of Artie as king, hinges on an almost accidental moment of self-actualization rather than deep, character-driven transformation. Artie's reluctant acceptance of the throne after charming the villains with his mediocrity feels like a narrative shortcut, sidestepping the difficult work of truly preparing an insecure youth for leadership. It underscores a theme prevalent in many sequels. Sometimes the easiest way out of a narrative corner is to convince the audience that being average is the highest form of heroism. Shrek, having outsourced his perceived burden, is then free to return to the swamp, not necessarily having conquered his fear of commitment to his royal duties, but having successfully navigated a single, immediate crisis. This reliance on delegating responsibility softens the necessary edge of Shrek's character growth. Fiona's concurrent journey into motherhood is handled with broad strokes, focusing more on the physical comedy of her water breaking during the siege than on the emotional weight of raising an ogre heir alongside a princess. Cameron Diaz portrays the steadfastness required of a queen in waiting, yet the film frames her imminent labor as an inconvenience to Shrek's quest, rather than a parallel, equally significant internal trial. Her scene where she rallies the women of the court, including the ugly stepsisters and Rapunzel, is a moment brimming with potential feminist agency, suggesting a powerful collective of female leadership ready to hold the line. However, this empowerment is functionally paused the second Shrek and Artie return, underscoring the film's commitment to placing the resolution squarely in the hands of the male protagonists. Even the secondary villains, the rejected fairy tale characters coerced by charming, feel more like props than genuine threats. Their motivations, a desire to be seen and acknowledged, mirror Shrek's initial plight, but this thematic echo is quickly dissolved in the chaos of the final confrontation. They represent the film's broader tendency to pull threads from earlier narratives without weaving them into a satisfying new tapestry. The spectacle of the siege is entertaining because the animation team deploys scale and noise effectively, but it lacks the emotional resonance of the stakes in the first film, where failure meant perpetual isolation for Shrek, or in the second, where the threat was the forced dissolution of his marriage. Here, the worst-case scenario is merely a temporary inconvenience under Charming's rule. Ultimately, Shrek the Third settles into a comfortable rhythm, prioritizing ensemble interaction and recognizable beats over narrative innovation. It is a product of its success, burdened by the need to deliver the expected comedic chemistry of its world-class voice cast, while navigating the challenge of advancing characters who have already achieved their romantic and personal goals. The film leaves the audience entertained, but slightly underwhelmed, having traded the subversive heart of the franchise for a warmer, more conventional depiction of domestic anxiety and inherited duty. The reliance on established chemistry is perhaps the most telling feature of this installment, suggesting a slight creative exhaustion when it came to forging new narrative pathways. The comfort level of the voice actors is palpable. They slip back into their roles as effortlessly as Shrek sinks into his mud bath. This ease, however, often translates on screen into predictability. We anticipate Donkey's inevitable tangent, Puss's dramatic flourish, and Shrek's exasperated groan with almost no suspense. It's the cinematic equivalent of a favorite, slightly worn armchair, cozy, but lacking the sharp edges that once defined the franchise. The thematic exploration of legacy, while present, is handled with a surprising lack of nuance. Artie's arc, intended to show that kingship isn't about pedigree but personality, feels unearned because his transformation is so sudden and reliant on external validation from the very villains he later pacifies through ineptitude. Justin Timberlake brings a definite youthful anxiety to Artie, but the writing forces him to jump too quickly from profound self-doubt to effective, if accidental, leadership. In contrast, Shrek's journey is regression, disguised as acceptance. He doesn't embrace his duty. He manages to delegate it convincingly and retreat to his perceived sanctuary. This subtly undermines the maturation seen in the first two films, suggesting that true happiness for an ogre means successfully avoiding the responsibilities thrust upon him by society. Fiona's brief turn as the sole regent while Shrek is away is the film's missed opportunity for substantive character evolution. Cameron Diaz imbues her with the necessary maternal steel, preparing for siege while simultaneously awaiting labor. This juxtaposition of high-stakes political defense and intensely personal biological transformation holds immense potential. Yet, the entire dramatic tension of this subplot is resolved the moment Shrek returns. The siege is broken, not primarily by Fiona's organized defense, but by the timely arrival of Shrek and Artie, reinforcing the trope that while women can manage the home front effectively, the ultimate resolution of the grand political conflict rests with the male heroes. Even the visual design seems to prioritize safety over innovation. The darker, more imposing aesthetic of Camelot under Charming's command offers brief respite from the pastoral glow of the swamp, but the overall visual language seems to adhere strictly to the blueprint established in Shrek 2. There are fewer of those breathtakingly imaginative sequences, like the giant gingerbread man or the potion-induced transformations, that made the earlier films feel revolutionary. This installment feels less like an evolution of the fairy tale subversion, and more like a consolidation of its best moments, packaged neatly for maximum immediate appeal, without striving for that earlier, boundary-pushing artistry. The film functions perfectly well as a family comedy, but it lacks the surprising bite of an artist fully confident in their ability to derail expectations. The lingering emotional residue of Shrek the Third is one of mild anticlimax, a feeling generated by a film that correctly identifies the needs of its established characters: Shrek's desire for domestic peace, Donkey's need for chaotic companionship, but fails to integrate these needs into a truly novel conflict. The film seems acutely aware that its protagonists have already won the main battle of acceptance. Consequently, the subsequent hurdles feel manufactured to justify another hour and a half of screen time. This results in a narrative that leans heavily on character quirks rather than escalating character stakes. The mentorship dynamic between Shrek and Artie, while intended to be a backbone of the plot, often feels padded. Justin Timberlake's Artie possesses a charming earnestness, but his primary function is to be the antithesis of Shrek, the non-ogre who desperately needs to find his own brand of self-worth. Shrek, in his reluctance to mentor, is essentially trying to mentor himself out of his impending responsibilities. The brilliance of the earlier films lay in Shrek confronting external societal judgment. Here, the judgment is purely self-imposed and easily solved by finding an external scapegoat, Artie, to take the crown. This delegation resolves Shrek's immediate anxiety, but leaves the deeper question of his commitment to the kingdom deliberately vague, suggesting that for an ogre, true happiness involves finding someone else to handle the paperwork. Prince Charming's portrayal by Rupert Everett continues to be a masterclass in committed camp, yet his renewed villainy feels like a necessary narrative device rather than a genuine threat. Charming embodies the fragile ego of the perpetually second best, his jealousy amplified by his understanding that he fits the conventional fairy tale mold perfectly, yet remains unwanted. His alliance with the forgotten fairy tale taps into a potent thematic vein, the disenfranchised finding power in unity. But this rebellion is quickly quashed. It's a spectacular visual opportunity, the siege itself, but emotionally hollow, because Charming's victory would only result in a superficial change of management, not the fundamental dismantling of the societal structures Shrek fought against initially. Furthermore, the film's handling of Fiona's pregnancy and impending motherhood, while providing rich ground for emotional exploration, is repeatedly interrupted or sidelined. Cameron Diaz plays Fiona with a grounded weariness that suggests the true difficulty of reigning while physically preparing for childbirth. Her brief leadership moment provides a glimpse of the competent, powerful queen she is destined to be. But the narrative insists on pulling Shrek back from his quest just in time to share the final, sentimental moment of childbirth. This reinforces a subtle, perhaps unintentional message. The grand adventure requires the male hero's return for the final emotional payoff, even when the female protagonist is demonstrably holding the line during the crisis. Shrek the Third is undeniably enjoyable due to the seasoned comedic instincts of its cast, but it sacrifices the groundbreaking, subversive spirit of its predecessors in favor of a safer, more predictable depiction of evolving domestic life. The film's reliance on a sprawling ensemble cast, while ensuring consistent comedic returns, ultimately contributes to its diluted focus. Each beloved character, from Donkey's hyperactive optimism to Puss in Boots's perpetually ready swashbuckling pose, receives ample screen time. Yet these sequences often feel like brightly colored diversions rather than integral plot advancements. Eddie Murphy's Donkey, in particular, functions as the movie's primary source of unpredictable, kinetic energy, a necessary counterbalance to Shrek's deepening inertia. The magical merging with Puss in Boots, while visually inventive, serves primarily to generate physical comedy, using the established chemistry between Murphy and Antonio Banderas to mask the fact that the central quest sometimes stalls. Banderas's Puss remains impeccably confident, a charming parody of the romantic hero whose dramatic flair only serves to accentuate Donkey's more chaotic nature. The narrative tension surrounding King Harold's absence and the subsequent power vacuum is resolved almost too neatly with Artie's recruitment. The problem isn't Artie's characterization. Justin Timberlake captures the essence of the perpetually overlooked underachiever perfectly, but the speed with which he embraces a destiny he spent his youth avoiding. The inspiration drawn from Camelot lore feels superficial. Artie learns that being himself is enough, a message that feels overly simplistic when contrasted with the complex societal barriers Shrek had to dismantle just to exist happily. Shrek's arc essentially becomes an elaborate exercise in passing the buck, finding a suitable replacement so he can return to his swamp, which feels less like true growth and more like successful avoidance management. The emotional weight of the film rests heavily on the shift from external prejudice to internal domestic pressure. Yet this transition is unevenly handled. Shrek's anxiety about fatherhood is genuine, but the film often prefers the gag about changing diapers over exploring the profound commitment required of leading a kingdom